So this isn't the first time I've spoken to your organization. I have spoken to them in 2004, a group of students at the Massachusetts State House, and I actually talked more about my political experience because I have a whole other talk that I could give on campaigning and Politics 101, and actually what they do, and I don't know if you still do this, if you have these days at the State House where they have rolling speakers, where speakers just come in and out. So my talk was actually interrupted by then Senator Barack Obama, who later became the President of the United States, obviously, so it's because of University of America I got to meet the President, so thank you. So I just wanted to share that story. So just to give you some background on myself, at that point when I was speaking at University of America, I was in state government and I served at the Massachusetts State House for close to 6 years. And that's actually where I got involved in this issue of human trafficking and modern slavery. And I started working with the Governor's Commission on Sexual and Domestic Violence through the Governor's Office. We actually have something here in Massachusetts that works on sexual and domestic violence issues at the time. In the early 2000s and the mid-2000s, it was about 340 public and private sector partners that worked to advise the governor and lieutenant governor on issues surrounding sexual and domestic violence. And I later became the co-chair of the steering committee of that commission, and then I became the executive director. And I started to work on this really interesting project that's still in existence today. It has a new name. And what they were doing is they were looking at how much teen prostitution was occurring in Suffolk County. We had no data on that. At the time, it was called the Suffolk County Teen Prostitution Prevention Project. It's now called the SEEN Coalition. People work with them, but that's actually originally how it started. And that's how I got into this issue, and then working through public policy and legislation on human trafficking. So I'm going to give you a bit of a public policy overview, talk about international human trafficking, and then talk about an area that I'm focusing on at Babson College, because I've been more on the academic public policy side, and looking at business solutions and public-private partnerships to human trafficking. So to take you back in time about how we originally got our laws on human trafficking, and I'm focusing on international protocols, this is the first part of where we get a lot of our laws today, and we can see the origins of this in the 1949 UN Convention for the Suppression of the Trafficking Persons and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others. And actually, this protocol came about from something that in the language in it, from something that happened here in the United States. There was this movement called the white slave trade movement. Has anyone heard of the white slave trade movement? Okay, it's something that we don't talk about often. I think we talk about it on the scholastic side, but we don't often hear about it in the history books. In the early part of the 20th century, there was something called the white slave trade movement. And basically, it was brought about through evangelicals in the middle part of the country, particularly in Illinois, in that area, and it was to look at prostitution and what was happening with what they call the white slave trade, and what was happening within brothels, and women who were forced, and women and girls who were forced to be in brothels. And it was very racialized because they didn't take account for African Americans who were also in prostitution. But it was called the white slave trade movement. Some critics say that it was basically to eradicate prostitution. It wasn't a huge phenomenon, but something came out of that movement. It was called the Mann Act. And the Mann Act is actually something we use today, and we actually just used it to prosecute a case in Rhode Island. And some of you may have heard about the Medfield teenager who was recently lured from the Medfield Public Library in September by a Missouri man and was taken across state lines to be forced into prostitution in Rhode Island. Actually, he's being convicted on the Mann Act, and that was something that originated in 1910 from the white slave trade movement. And it basically was, the act made it illegal for women and girls to be trafficked across state lines, and they started using this terminology, trafficking. There was a lot of conversation about that and the use of that word. So it was the movement of people across state lines for the purpose of prostitution, and we still use this law today. So that law and that movement, a lot of scholars believe, influenced some of the language in this 1949 UN Convention for the Suppression of the Trafficking Persons and the Exploitation of Prostitution of Others. So it's focused on women and children mostly in the protocol, and it emerges out of this abolitionist movement they call the white slave trade movement. an abolitionist movement and basing it on some language like 19th century historical slavery. And so it does not criminalize women and children in prostitution, so it takes the criminalization away from women and children and more on the perpetrator of the crime. And then it also says that countries cannot regulate prostitution, thereby making it more legalized or allowing it to happen, so that's what that particular piece means. And then creates protection mechanisms for victims of trafficking. So again, some of the language that was used in the Mann Act that influenced this protocol in 1949. Next slide. So then we fast forward to 2000, and this is the UN Palermo Protocol. And Liz actually talked a bit about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act here in the United States, which is our federal act on trafficking. And actually that comes from this UN Palermo Protocol. This is the template for it. 150 countries now have used this template to pass their national laws on human trafficking. So this is the language, and you'll see that some of this may sound familiar with what Liz was talking about, with what is in our laws here in the United States. And again, we talk about this idea, do you have to have movement to have human trafficking, and you actually don't. Even though I just said in the Mann Act where it's actually going across borders that creates that act, trafficking in itself, you don't have to have movement. You can actually be trafficked from upstairs to downstairs. It's the harboring, it's the force, the fraud, the coercion, and again, you see that language in this slide, and I apologize that it's so wordy, but I think it's really important to see all the different language that you have in these laws and how it explains what the problem is. And then the other interesting thing about the UN Palermo Protocol, which is different than what we have here in the United States, it includes the different types of human trafficking, but it also includes servitude or the removal of organs. And in the United States, and this is something that I also work on, we do not include within our legal human trafficking framework on a federal level, human trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. And what we're seeing now in the field is we're seeing some evidence where we have people who are taken for sex and or labor, and then they have a kidney forcibly removed, or an eye, or it's how much can you exploit a person? I've heard a story, it's anecdotal, we don't have any data on it, of an orphanage in Mexico that's using children for pornography, and they have kidneys or they have some type of organ removal, and they're sold in the black market. So this is something that I'm actually working on with some other public health scholars and people who are working for non-governmental organizations who are looking to try to find data on how much this is occurring within a human trafficking framework, and do we make the argument that this should be included as part of our legal framework here in the United States. So Liz went over some of the numbers on human trafficking, and I'm just going to go over again, just as Liz said, there's so many different studies that give a variety of numbers about how big the problem is. And the study that I use here, which is consistent with what Liz was talking about, this is an International Labor Organization study in 2012. It's 20.9 million adults are held in bondage. Again, the numbers range from 4 to 27 million, and this is a global scale, and they equate it as forced labor, so they put everything in together in terms of human trafficking, and they call it forced labor. So women and girls make up 55% of this number, and adults are more affected than children, with 74% of adults who are in forced labor above 18 years of age, and then children make up 26% of that. So that gives you a sense of the scope. And then this is a breakdown of that particular study, and it says forced labor exploitation is 68% of that. So I know we've heard a lot about sex trafficking in the media, in particularly, and a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, we even said that that was the most predominant form of human trafficking. Well, it's actually not. We know now that, and some of the evidence we're seeing is that labor exploitation and labor trafficking is the highest amount of trafficking out there. And that includes agriculture, construction, domestic work, or more manufacturing, everything that goes into what labor trafficking is. Forced sexual exploitation comes in at 22%. And then the International Labor Organization, which is a UN entity, does include prison, state military, or armed forces at 10%. You have certain situations in countries like Uganda. There's some cases of this in South America, Latin America, where you have children who are enlisted in rebel armies, child soldiers. Some of you may have heard of that. Often they can be sex slaves as well, so it's almost like a mixed form of human trafficking where you have sex trafficking and labor trafficking combined. And so they include that within this 10% category. So this is a regional breakdown internationally of what is happening. So the Asia Pacific region comes in at 50% of that 20.9 number. Africa comes in at 18%, Latin America and the Caribbean at 9%, Central, Southeast, and Eastern Europe come in at 7%, developed economies and the EU, which includes the United States, come in at 7%, and the Middle East is at 3%. And those are based on the numbers that are reporting into the ILO, so that is the best number that they came up with for that. Okay, so more on the scope, and again, these are similar numbers to what Liz had talked about. Annually, 600,000 to 800,000 are trafficked across national borders. That's a U.S. government figure. That number has been highly debated, but it's still the only number that we're working with in terms of what is happening annually. In the United States, 14,500 to 17,500 foreign nationals are trafficked into the country annually, and then 1 million children are exploited by the global commercial sex trade every year. And just to bring it home here to Massachusetts, we've talked a bit internationally on this. We do have trafficking here in Massachusetts. I just mentioned that Medfield case. We just had a recent case, some of you may have seen in the news, on January 16th. The Fall River woman that was accused of trafficking minors for sexual servitude, and she worked in collaboration with another Fall River man who was actually exploiting the girls, and he is being called a John, and so he's being convicted based on that offense, and so that's going to be an ongoing case. And we've also had other cases of labor trafficking, domestic servitude in homes of a diplomat. We've had cases of H-2B visa workers, and that's a non-agricultural work visa, who are kept against their will. People working in massage parlors who are in sexual servitude, but they're also being trafficked for labor. So that's a mixed form of human trafficking. And the case that hits really close to home is actually right behind my local mall, right behind my dentist. We had a case around 2005 of a criminal ring moving women in the Boston area to different apartment-style brothels. So there was an apartment complex in Peabody, which is where my dentist is, right behind my dentist, where they were keeping women from China and Vietnam and Thailand against their will and in sexual servitude. So it's happening right here in our suburbs. We've had a few cases in Wellesley, right near Babson College, where I work. So it's not something that's remote in other places. It's happening right here in Massachusetts, and we don't know the total numbers. We're still looking at that, but we do know that it is indeed happening here. So to tell you a bit more about some of the work that I'm doing on the issue of public-private partnerships and corporations and human trafficking, I am actually working on a project right now with the World Economic Forum. Some of you may have heard of the forum's work, and I sit on a council called the Global Agenda Council on Organized Crime and Illicit Trade. And I am doing an inter-council project that I'm co-leading with another colleague in the anti-trafficking field to look at what businesses are doing to fight human trafficking. So sometimes we think of businesses as these big corporate entities that don't have feelings and they just want to make a profit. But there's actually a lot of good that's being done with a lot of corporations around the world to fight human trafficking. And what we want to do is look at what they're doing and see how it's working, how it might not be working, and what can we do to make it better? And if it is working, can we ask other companies to do the same thing and to make it broader? So this organization is called the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and it's actually right here in the United States. It's an organization that is a conglomeration of all different companies, and these are some of the companies that are listed. There are actually more companies that are in this group, but these are the main companies that initiated it. And so I can give you examples of what some of the companies are doing. So everybody's familiar with Coca-Cola. Everybody drinks Coke. So Coca-Cola is doing a ton of work on human trafficking. They actually have their own human rights and labor division in Atlanta. And they're working on looking at supply chain issues related to the manufacturing of Coca-Cola. in their plants around the world. And when we talk about supply chains, that's everything that goes into making a product from start to finish, every material that goes into a product. And is that happening in a fair trade? You've heard of fair trade. Is that happening in a fair way? Are people being exploited? Is trafficking involved in the supply chain? And often some of these supply chains are so intricate, so detailed. So oftentimes you have things that are sent out and not, made within one factory. They go from place to place. So it's a very complex process to analyze, but we're starting to do this, and we're starting to see how our goods are made, and consumers are demanding to have goods made in a good way. So Coca-Cola is trying to make sure that their plants are adhering with and not having labor trafficking. There's a serious code of conduct with how they have to conduct their business. So they're doing a ton on that. The travel and tourism industry is doing so much on human trafficking, and you'll see some of the travel organizations represented. Travelport, they do a lot on corporate sustainability and travel and tourism. Delta Airlines, many of you have, I'm sure, flown in Delta. Hilton, Carlson Wagonlit Travel, they're a big travel conglomerate out of Minnesota. And other organizations involved are Marriott Hotels International. Marriott is a great example. They had a grant from the U.S. State Department. This is an example of public-private partnerships where they are training youth in a hotel in Mexico, and these are youth who've been trafficked, so that these youth will have economic opportunities later on, so they will not be at risk for re-trafficking. And they receive some funding to train these young men and women in their hotels so they have a livelihood. So it's a great example of a public-private partnership. The airlines are doing a great deal on this, and there's actually a great public-private partnership that's working on this with Innocence at Risk. I don't know if anybody's heard of Innocence at Risk. They're working with all the major airlines and some of their travel partners to train airline personnel. Because when you think of the front lines of trafficking and where someone, a citizen or someone who's on the outside world might see this happening, you think of airplanes. And so if every airline personnel member was trained on this, how could we save a life? And so Innocence at Risk has really taken this on, and they're training all the major airlines and their personnel through something called the Blue Ribbon Campaign. And that's also involving the Department of Homeland Security and other government entities to train airline personnel. The hotels are also doing some work, are looking at their supply chains of what goes into their hotels. So when you think of everything that goes into a hotel, the linens, the food, the lamps, everything that goes into it, have those all been made through fair labor and not trafficked goods? Also, when you think of prostitution, a lot of the prostitution is happening in the hotels. So they're training their personnel, again, to be aware and to see something and to say something if they see something that's going on in their hotels. And so globally, Starwood has now signed on, and other major hotel companies. Ford is looking at this from a manufacturing point of view. Obviously, Ford is a huge manufacturer of cars. So they're looking at from supply chain and labor. LexisNexis is a legal they do legal online database work. They do technology. So they've actually been helping with technical assistance to anti-trafficking organizations, and they've designed databases to look and compile data on human trafficking and modern slavery. So they're helping in that respect. So these companies are doing what they can. And one organization that I want to mention that's not in here that I adore, and I think they're doing fantastic work. They have one of the best websites out there in the field, are Truckers Against Human Trafficking. So the truckers have gotten together, and it started in Oklahoma in 2009 by a group of people in the trucking industry, truckers. And so now they have an executive director, they have a full-fledged nonprofit, and they're working with a number of trucking organizations, partnerships, corporations, anybody who's really involved with the trucking industry, and they're doing lobbying, they're doing trainings. And actually, one of their most notable trainings, they trained a bunch of truckers, I think it was out in Nevada. And from one of the truckers reported a case of human trafficking. They had 9 rescue victims. It was a sexual trafficking case. 9 rescue victims, 31 traffickers, and they broke up an organized crime ring in 13 states. So that shows you what one person can do in trying to help a situation of human trafficking, and a great example of a public-private partnership. And Now Canada has actually, they have an organization now called Truck Stop, and they are replicating what the truckers are doing.